fullest extent of the law for their complicity in and perpetration of terrorism.
Anti-cultists' influence on law enforcement agencies.
Public activities of anti-cultists are merely a preparatory stage for further involving law enforcement and security forces in suppressing religious groups. For this purpose, under the guise of educational work, members of anti-cult organizations deliver lectures and arrange consultations for law enforcement agencies, including police academies and security management, where they continue to propagate the same messages that cult members are a threat to society.
Anti-cultist Alexander Dvorkin gave a lesson to students in Chelyabinsk.
Cults lure people in through deception, withholding information, and dishonest advertising. Cults are dangerous to individuals because they enslave personality and turn a human into an obedient tool in the hands of cult leaders.
Such activities are not only unacceptable, but also dangerous, as they aim to instill radical ideology in the minds of security officials, which can have far-reaching consequences for society and the state as a whole.
Several eyewitness stories will help illustrate the seriousness of the problem and serve as examples of what terrorist anti-cult propaganda is capable of in the modern, civilized 21st century. First-person account from Andrei in Belgorod. Requested anonymity.
There were actions taken against us. For example, in the fall of 2012, we held a congress. The area was cordoned off by Cossacks with whips. They beat drums, invited the NTV television company and local media, and portrayed our activities in a negative light. They shouted at us, "We'll throw a grenade at you," and the police did not react at all. At some of the actions against Jehovah's Witnesses, they wore T-shirts that said, "I hate Jehovah's Witnesses." I was directly threatened. "Aren't you afraid you'll get hit on the head and be disabled for life?" Given what I've witnessed since around 2010, I believe it will only worsen.
My dear ones, please, if you carry your faith, carry it with peace and kindness. We've never stabbed anyone, and we're not going to stab anyone.
In 2014, an elderly fellow believer was killed in Stary Oskol. She was on her way to a meeting, got into an elevator, and was found with multiple stab wounds, and her eyes gouged out. The local media wrote that she was a member of one of the cults, which is how they often refer to us. The perpetrators were never found. Our sister was beaten in her own apartment building by a man who then dragged her around the building. Funeral wreaths with inscriptions "To victims of the Watchtower" were placed at our Kingdom Hall in Belgorod, and swastikas were painted on the building's walls. I believe that the persecution of Jehovah's Witnesses is orchestrated by the FSB. In their view, Jehovah's Witnesses do not fit into the political framework of today's Russia. The Fifth Directorate of the KGB used to persecute dissenters. Today, it is the Directorate for the Protection of the Constitutional Order of the FSB. This is the political police. Jehovah's Witnesses refuse military service and do not support any political forces, which does not align with the ideology of modern Russia. I think the Russian Orthodox Church, ROC, plays the role assigned to it by the FSB. If we look at the history of the ROC as it exists today, it was created by Stalin's order in 1943. Since then, this religious organization has been a structural subdivision of the State Security Committee, which is now the FSB of Russia. Experienced police officers have told me that they don't understand why they are being forced to persecute people for their religion. One even said that under the current government, it has become embarrassing to work in the police force because they are detaining elderly women for talking about the Bible, apprehending people on the street for unclear reasons, breaking into apartments, and so on. What is happening to Jehovah's Witnesses in Russia today can happen to anyone, to any political or religious movement, such as Baptists, Pentecostals, or the autonomous Russian Orthodox Church. They are already under pressure and are at risk. The broad definitions of anti-extremist laws allow for the persecution of anyone. We know that people can be imprisoned for reposting something on the internet or for making a simple statement deemed extremist, using the law to force this into the so-called legal framework.
In 2017, due to lobbying by Dvorkin and members of his group, Jehovah's Witnesses were declared an extremist organization, and their activities were banned in Russia. From that moment, the repression against them intensified and continues to this day. Members of this religious organization face arrests, searches, and prosecutions, as well as cruel treatment and even torture. Some of them, including elderly people and retirees, have been sentenced to long terms in penal colonies and imprisonment for their beliefs and religious activities.
The editorial collegium of the Supreme Court of the Russian Federation has determined the decision of the Supreme Court of the Russian Federation dated April 20th, 2017 remains unchanged, and the appellate complaint of the Religious Organization Administrative Center of Jehovah's Witnesses in Russia is dismissed.
Freedom of conscience in Russia has been crucified. There is no doubt that what happened to Jehovah's Witnesses will affect other denominations as well. A little bit later, religious persecutions will begin in Russia. There will be prisoners of conscience. The very term cult is certainly used as a stigma, as a label intended to turn people away from Jehovah's Witnesses, as well as from other organizations that are also labeled as cults by anti-cult activists or other opponents. If we assess the contribution of the anti-cult movement to the persecution of Jehovah's Witnesses, I believe it plays an overwhelmingly negative role and largely contributes to the expansion of persecutions against peaceful believers who simply seek to satisfy their religious needs, guaranteed by the Constitution of the Russian Federation. The right to satisfy their religious needs, including the right to collectively profess their religion. Believers are already facing persecution, attacks, and physical violence in places where meetings and gatherings used to take place. They are subjected to acts of vandalism. We fear that this will become widespread. People who are guilty of nothing other than adhering to certain religious beliefs will find themselves targeted by those who consider them enemies of society.
As for liquidation of the Jehovah's Witnesses organization, in this regard, I have no disagreement with it. The ban on the organization is undoubtedly helpful. Primarily, we no longer see Jehovah's Witnesses in the streets, and consequently, people are protected from their intrusive propaganda and recruitment. When we talk about Jehovah's Witnesses, I certainly hope that their ordinary members will at least receive administrative penalties, but I understand that I'm not a lawyer and the law is the law.
They poured water on my hands and started hitting them with a taser. At that moment, it was the most painful sensation. I was electrocuted, just like other people were. They hit me on the head, they hit me in the ribs, on the right side of my body. They put a blue plastic bag over my head, tightened it, and I began to suffocate. At the moment when I began to suffocate, they put a hand over my mouth and put a taser on my buttocks in the crotch area. I think, apparently, it was a taser, and they started an electric current. When I was interrogated, apparently someone was brought into the adjacent room again, so I heard everything clearly. There were electric shocks and screams. Some names, surnames, and addresses. I said I would only cooperate with the investigator in the presence of my lawyer. Then they put a hat on my face and took me out into the woods behind the stadium.
This is what the consequences of dehumanization lead to. All these people are just like you. The only difference is how and what they believe in. They harm no one and infringe on no one's rights. All they do is express their views on the world and life differently. For this alone, they are publicly stripped of their humanity, slandered, and targeted by society, law enforcement, and security agencies. Even some law enforcement officers bound to follow orders understand this is absurd. They are ashamed to carry out these orders but cannot disobey. As a result, ordinary people branded by anti-cultists, along with their families, children, and loved ones, suffer immense hardships.
I'm now talking about citizens. Surely they are being taken care of by banning this cult, first and foremost, right? But we'll discuss that further. At this very moment, when they exist somewhere out there, we see them only on the internet, appearing in some news stories. So they...
Actually, we neither see nor hear them precisely because there is this persecution. Hence, they are now hiding, sitting quietly, and waiting to see how it will all end. Because if it weren't for that, you would see them everywhere now.
I cannot avoid quoting the words of President Putin. On December 11th, 2018, he said, "We should treat representatives of all religions equally. We should not classify representatives of religious communities as some kind of destructive, not to mention terrorist organizations." Of course, this is complete nonsense. Jehovah's Witnesses are also Christians. I don't understand why they should be persecuted. So, what do we persecute them for?
Firstly, I disagree with President Putin that Jehovah's Witnesses are Christians. They are not Christians. Christians are those who believe in divinity in Christ, while Jehovah's Witnesses do not believe in the deity of Christ. They are Jehovists. Their main god, whom they believe in, is Jehovah, so according to the rules, they should be called Jehovists.
But they don't deny Christ.
However, they don't consider him God. Muslims do not deny Christ either, but they don't consider him God. Muslims are not Christians. So this...
But Muslims are not banned, while Jehovists are...
Muslims are not, but Jehovists are banned. This is my position.
You might ask, why do law enforcement officers who are supposed to protect people, uphold the law and safeguard the democratic rights of everyone, openly exhibit hatred towards innocent people, insult them, and cause severe physical harm? Because just like in the times of Nazism, the leaders of the anti-cult movement have subjected these law enforcement and security personnel to propaganda, deliberately warping their thinking, imposing the image of an enemy, and manipulating their perceptions.
The new presidential decree is changing the situation. We are not abandoning our mission of presence that has proven to be very effective in missionary work. But now, under the new strategy, we will act more openly, without fearing external persecution, which, I must admit, does happen. There are people in power structures who find our activities irritating and unacceptable. Now, such an attitude towards us and our work will be seen as opposition to the presidential decree. I've been collaborating with law enforcement and military agencies for many years, giving lectures to their personnel about the essence of modern cultism, which is poorly understood in society. This is despite the church paying very close attention to anti-cultist activities. I've been dealing with this issue for 30 years myself. In my presentations, I have to explain a lot to cadets, law enforcement officers, and military personnel. I call the new presidential decree a real gift to us, Orthodox missionaries. In the section, Expected Results of the Implementation of this strategy, it is stated that this strategy should contribute to stabilization of the social and political situation in our country, as well as to the spiritual and civic unity of the peoples of the Russian Federation, including through the activities of the Russian Orthodox Church and the broad Orthodox mission that enlightens and educates all peoples. Tuck your feet, down on the floor, down.
According to the Memorial Human Rights Center, as of April this year, at least 635 Jehovah's Witnesses have been persecuted in Russia, with no fewer than 568 people facing criminal charges.
I hoped he would leave for an hour or two. However, by evening, I realized he wouldn't return either today or probably even tomorrow.
I couldn't sleep for several nights. It was terrifying for me when evening came.
Our family's life started to divide into before and after. The feelings we experienced that evening, humiliation, moral and physical abuse, and much more.
But when militants in camouflage break in like that to old frail people, that shocks me.
Think about it. Law enforcement officers who took an oath and are obligated to protect the citizens of their country are attacking peaceful members of an unjustly branded, cornered, and discredited organization. They no longer see these individuals as citizens or even as people, but as soulless, inferior beings because anti-cultists have labeled them with a yellow star for believing in God differently. These are the Nazi methods imposed by anti-cult organizations. First, the label cult is applied by anti-cultists, and then the state assigns the status of extremism. Anti-cultists successfully use these methods not only in Russia, but also in Europe and worldwide. The very existence of anti-cult organizations violates one of the fundamental human freedoms, the freedom of conscience and religion. To deprive someone of the ability to believe in what they choose is to strip them of a basic need, similar to the need for food or drink. It's as if you were forbidden to eat bread because a bunch of radical extremists decided you aren't even human. And if you're not considered human, you can't behave like one. This means you don't deserve humane treatment and cannot have human rights and freedoms. To help you understand what these people branded as cult members by anti-cultists and no longer protected by the law feel, let me give you a simple example. Imagine you're at home, sitting down for dinner. Suppose you have a habit of eating bread in a particular way. Maybe you prefer to separate the crust from the crumb and eat them separately, meaning you simply eat bread differently than most people. Now, because of this, the police forcibly break into your home, turn your personal belongings upside down, damage your property, scare your children, eat you, and arrest you. How would you feel in such a situation? That is precisely how those targeted by anti-cultists feel today. What wrong have these people done? They did not break into others' homes, they did not violate the law, and they did not force their beliefs on anyone. Unlike the way the dominant religion is imposed in some countries, they did not infringe on others' rights. They simply ate bread differently because it suited them better. But someone didn't like that, so they were stripped of their humanity.
The persecution of Jehovah's Witnesses in Russia has been widely condemned both by the general public within Russia and internationally, by representatives of human rights organizations and officials from various countries. The European Court of Human Rights, ECHR, ruled that the persecution of Jehovah's Witnesses in Russia violates human rights. However, the persecution continues to this day, and instigators of hatred and informational terrorism, such as Alexander Dvorkin and his associates, have not been held accountable or received the punishment they deserve. Charge: dehumanization. The denial of individuals in any religious or ideological group their status as human beings is an activity aimed at denying human rights, and is qualified as acts, methods, and practices of terrorism. The stance of leaders of anti-cult organizations, such as Fekris and Ratziers, that the members of what they call cults or sects are not considered to be humans, directly violates the rights of such people to legal capacity, which guarantees that every person is regarded as an individual with rights. By their statements and actions, representatives of anti-cult organizations deny the principles of pluralism, one of the most important democratic pillars. Accordingly, under the definition in the resolution adopted by the UN General Assembly on June 22, 2023, this activity is considered terrorism.
An additional decision on liquidation due to extremist activities has been adopted and entered into force.
They put a submachine gun right to his forehead, pushed him back, and started shouting, "Where's the family? Where is your family?" Tell me, what are you detained for?
For my faith in God.
Lift your head. Look here.
And what kind of literature did they find at your home?
Bible and other Christian books.
Yeah, I got scared.
Criminal scheme by anti-cult terrorists.
So, let's summarize. The typical scheme of terrorist actions by the anti-cult movement against a targeted group follows universally precise steps. It begins with labeling the group as a cult or a sect, continues with stigmatizing the group in public opinion, fabricating accusations and criminal cases, and ends with discrimination against members of the targeted group, persecution, and the use of physical violence, up to murders. According to this model, anti-cult terrorists can persecute absolutely any group of people, whether religious or secular. It doesn't matter. The most crucial steps are labeling and initiating a media campaign to discredit the victim in the media. Once this is achieved, implementing the remaining steps is only a matter of time.
In the course of organizing persecution against targeted groups, members of anti-cult movements and their accomplices engage in a range of criminal schemes, such as criminal schemes implemented by representatives of the anti-cult movement, spreading and implementing extremist ideology, inciting conflicts on religious grounds, conducting provocations against members of religious organizations based on religious hatred and/or commercial interests, including using informal connections within law enforcement and other government agencies, fabricating administrative and criminal cases against religious organizations and their members through corrupt connections, manipulating judicial examinations concerning religious associations, preparing false witnesses for court proceedings, public funding fraud, engaging in fraudulent activities, leaders and members of anti-cult organizations have repeatedly been found guilty by courts of violating human rights and freedoms. Numerous facts and cases have accumulated where European courts in Germany, France, Canada, Spain, the United Kingdom, Switzerland, and Austria have found participants in organizations affiliated with the Fekris network guilty of numerous offenses, including defamation, discrimination, and unlawful restriction of freedom. The violations they committed have had significant consequences for religious groups and their members, including social ostracism, job dismissals, denial of employment and medical examinations, educational problems for their children, and other issues. However, despite the clear violations of laws, anti-cult organizations continue to operate, receive state funding, and conduct their anti-democratic and inhumane criminal activities. The activities and rhetoric of anti-cult organizations violate universally recognized human rights and freedoms protected by international law and enshrined in international documents, such as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the European Convention on Human Rights, as well as the constitutions and national laws of various countries. Specifically, the right to freedom of thought, conscience, and religion, the right to freedom of speech, the right to equal protection against any form of discrimination, the right to life, liberty, and personal security, the right to the presumption of innocence, to be considered innocent until proven guilty according to the law, and so on. Representatives of the anti-cult movement violate the following international legal norms.
anti-cult organizations, through their activities, completely deny the rights of millions of people to freedom of thought, conscience, and religion, to freedom of belief and its free expression, which are universally recognized democratic values. However, to accuse them only of this is akin to giving a fine to a terrorist who stormed a building and shot people just for improperly parking his car before doing so. All members of anti-cult organizations and their accomplices should be held criminally responsible for their deliberate terrorist activities. In their charters, anti-cult organizations declare a noble mission to combat potentially dangerous, destructive religious movements to protect society from them. However, their actual goals differ significantly from the stated ones. By accusing the innocent of potential danger, they actually commit numerous heinous crimes. If the true goal of anti-cult organizations were indeed to protect citizens, they would not violate their rights or resort to illegal methods and informational terrorism. Instead of spreading into religious discord in society, they would approach state authorities with requests to investigate a particular organization, adhering to the principle of the presumption of innocence. Only if a violation of the law is established through a lawful investigation and a court verdict is issued could they engage in educational activities, informing the public about the potential dangers of specific religious movements. And only after a court decision would media representatives have the right to disseminate this information in an accusatory context. Without evidence and a court ruling, no one has the right to accuse anyone, make public unfounded statements, and ruin someone's life. People who follow a particular belief are exercising their democratic rights. The presumption of innocence, freedom of speech, freedom of peaceful assembly, freedom of religion, and pluralism of opinions are the foundations of democracy. Upholding these rights is a genuine concern for people in society. But anti-cultists do not seek this. Their goals lie elsewhere. Moreover, they are not interested in having their targets investigated by authorized bodies and quickly shut down legally if found guilty. They need a long-term, demonstrative crackdown on innocent people. Their aim is to instill fear in the masses and influence the authorities by provoking acts of persecution and repression against social and religious groups. Staging a public execution, this is a true act of informational terrorism. Each instance of an anti-cultist fight against dissent is a terrorist act, where each yellow star from them marks the beginning of a terrorist attack. As I mentioned before, any act of terrorism is defined by its goal. The harassment of innocents carried out by anti-cultists causes double damage. First, to the victims who suffer, and second, to the unwilling witnesses of these actions who feel powerless in the face of such injustice. Each such act is accompanied by clear violations of fundamental rights and freedoms. What do citizens see in such cases? They see that the laws in their country do not work, that their rights and liberties are being grossly violated, and that the authorities turn a blind eye to this. They see that those who were supposed to protect them have sided with the enemy and are attacking them. And they understand that anyone, including themselves, could be the next to be marked with a yellow star. This situation undermines trust in the authorities, provokes social tension, and increases dissatisfaction among the population. The result is a divided society filled with hatred and fear, ready to explode and express its discontent at any moment. This, in turn, creates the potential for a sudden surge in revolutionary sentiments or interreligious conflicts. Therefore, the actions of anti-cult organizations must be classified exclusively as terrorist activities, which is what they truly are.
What is it anyway? Is it religious disagreements, politics, some modern trend? It's unclear.
It's an attempt to straighten all the non-straight lines, so to speak. Everything that is not ours is, whoever is not with us is against us. Everything that is not ours is hostile. In this repressive wheel that is slowly rolling, I see nothing rational in it. Because it doesn't increase the government's rating, It doesn't increase trust in the authorities. It doesn't improve anything. It doesn't contribute to anything except increasing overall aggressiveness and general embitterment. Because any governmental cruelty increases the level of public cruelty, in fact. It always happens this way. The degree of overall cruelty rises. Besides this, I see no other consequences. And of course, I think it makes people exasperated. It makes them bitter towards each other, towards the authorities, towards the world around, towards everything and everyone.
In this regard, I'd like to emphasize once again that in the informational acts of terrorism committed by anti-cult terrorists, the key role is played by the media, or more precisely, by certain unscrupulous and dishonest representatives within it. It is through their efforts that the demonization and defamation of innocent people occur. These same individuals, journalists and editors, are the ones who spread hateful statements and destructive messages from anti-cult organizations. By doing so, they not only shape public opinion, but also provoke surges of aggression and conflicts on religious grounds. Each stage of the deliberate persecution of religious groups, from labeling to complete suppression, is supported by propaganda in the media. These information campaigns aim to justify criminal actions and endorse the persecution of the targeted organization, which is unacceptable, even after the victim organization ceases to exist, or worse, when its members face brutal physical violence, including fatal incidents. Media representatives continue to insist that such an outcome is inevitable, necessary, and just. In fact, these media representatives are perpetrators of informational terrorism and often instigators of direct terrorist acts. Many people have suffered at their hands, and many continue to suffer to this day. Their efforts have caused many people to endure torture, lose their health, and lose faith in people and the future. Therefore, according to the law, all journalists, editors, publishers, and media employees who aided the anti-cultists should be held accountable for crimes related to terrorist activities.
Each such publication violates citizens' fundamental rights and freedoms, guaranteed by the Constitution and international legal norms. By committing acts of informational terrorism, media representatives undermine the foundations of democracy and effectively act against their own people and country, which, in the context of an undeclared covert war, plays into the hands of the enemy of the free world and constitutes collaborationism. By participating in the criminal scheme of terrorist anti-cult groups, acting deliberately and in collusion, these individuals commit treason. An example of how the image of an organization stigmatized through the media can be further used by anti-cultists to destabilize the country is guilt by association. Anti-cult groups deliberately associate politicians or representatives of authority with discredited organizations, thereby lowering their ratings and tarnishing their reputations in the eyes of the public. Ultimately, this can lead to removal of those politicians from the political arena. As a result, in countries where anti-cultists wield significant influence, their activity undermines and destabilizes the state. Such actions benefit the enemy, the hidden forces behind the anti-cultists, because they facilitate the achievement of their strategic objectives, the destruction of democratic laws, and the creation of conditions for totalitarianism. Thus, media representatives bear full responsibility for their actions, just as all participants in this criminal scheme do. The anti-cult movement representatives, those behind them, and all who abetted them are equally guilty of a range of offenses and must be held accountable under the law. Charge: the activities of anti-cult organizations sow panic in society, incite discord, create an atmosphere of fear and uncertainty, undermine public order and stability, and threaten the sovereignty and territorial integrity of states, as well as the protection of their citizens from external and internal threats. This destabilizing activity directly threatens the sovereignty, territorial integrity, and security of states, which, according to the UN resolution of June 22, 2023, constitutes terrorism.
It is well known that the more religions and freedoms of opinion exist in a state, the more stable and democratic it becomes. People feel freer and more courageous. They are ready to defend their country, serve it, and contribute to society. Pluralism of opinions ensures safety and stability by preventing the concentration of power in one set of hands. This is precisely why the First Amendment was added to the U.S. Constitution. However, the actions of anti-cult organizations threaten this diversity and endanger states themselves by provoking the destabilization of the democratic system, which, according to international acts, is also a form of terrorism. The long-term nature of such terrorist acts and the use of secretive manipulative technologies has made their execution inconspicuous for a long time. It has complicated the proof of guilt of their organizers, but now the time has come when all individuals involved in such actions, representatives of anti-cult organizations, the media, law enforcement, security forces, those engaged in persecution, searches, arrests, falsified trials, as well as politicians and individual officials, must be identified, held accountable, and punished to the full extent of the law for treason, creating an international terrorist network, complicity in terrorist activities, and the systematic execution of terrorist acts.
Charge. The activities of anti-cult organizations represent a new, dangerous form of terrorism. Therefore, the international network of the anti-cult movement must be recognized by the global community as a network of terrorist organizations. The UN resolution of June 22, 2023, clearly established this by providing a comprehensive definition of terrorism. Terrorism are activities aimed at the denial of human rights, fundamental freedoms, and democracy, and actions impeding the enjoyment of political, civil, economic, social, and cultural rights, including the right to life, liberty, and security. In other words, these are actions or practices that directly or indirectly undermine or violate fundamental human rights and freedoms and the principles of democracy. How to defend your rights and freedoms. The public must be informed about the potential dangers of informational terrorism and possess the necessary knowledge to recognize it in the daily flow of news and information from social media and other media platforms. Right now, every citizen who is aware of the signs of informational terrorism can take active steps to prevent it. Suppose you discover instances of informational terrorism in the media in your country. In that case, you have the right and duty to contact the Attorney General and demand an appropriate investigation and measures to stop the activities of the group committing that. Competent authorities must promptly take measures to establish the fact of a terrorist act in the public domain or refute it with appropriate evidence. In accordance with the principles of the rule of law and democracy, the Attorney General must publicly report on the work done within a set time frame. Suppose the fact of an informational terrorist act is confirmed. In that case, people should be informed about its goals, objectives, and the extent of the harm caused to reduce the negative consequences of the attack. Since informational terrorist acts are conducted in the public sphere, the quicker society reacts to them, and the faster competent authorities take measures to neutralize them and hold those responsible accountable, the less harm these terrorist acts will cause to the entire society. Conversely, suppose an informational terrorist act occurs, and the public and law enforcement agencies ignore it. In that case, the terrorist act achieves its goals, and the destructive consequences for both citizens and the entire country are amplified significantly. Therefore, society must monitor the integrity of the information field and promptly report any informational terrorist acts discovered in the media, and the relevant authorities must respond swiftly to citizens' reports. If, after citizens request an investigation into an informational terrorist act, the Attorney General does not provide a public report on the work done, does not disclose the investigation results, and does not take measures to stop the activities of those committing informational terrorism within the legally established time frame, this should raise justified doubts about their competence. The lack of active measures from the Attorney General could be seen as possible complicity in criminal activities or deliberate aiding of the perpetrators. In such a case, citizens have the legal right to initiate the procedure for removing the Attorney General from office for actions that contradict the interests of the people and the state. Moreover, if the Attorney General, in their position, allows informational terrorist acts to be committed and lets the perpetrators go unpunished, then they themselves should be held accountable under the law for aiding terrorism and participating in the activities of a terrorist network. The presence of an individual in a significant governmental role who supports terrorism poses a serious threat to national security and the stability of the law enforcement system. Therefore, if the Attorney General fails to fulfill their duties to protect the rights and freedoms of the people, any citizen has the right to appeal to the higher authorities responsible for appointing the Attorney General in your country, requesting that they be peacefully and lawfully removed from office. As citizens, you must also understand your own responsibility. If you witness any form of terrorism and choose to remain silent, you similarly become an accomplice to the crime. Silence in such circumstances can be regarded as a form of criminal inaction. If you witness an attack on your rights and freedoms, an attack on democracy, do not remain silent. Inform the competent authorities. After all, the consequences of such a terrorist act will affect you first and foremost. In light of recent events, which have made it clear how much impact information can have on the world, covering up informational terrorism is equivalent to depriving yourself and your children of a future. Therefore, if you encounter informational terrorist acts in the media in your country, report them and demand that the activities of these informational terrorists be stopped. Protect your rights and ensure a safe future for yourself and your children.
In a democratic world, anti-cult organizations should not exist at all, as their very essence contradicts democracy and the pluralism of views on which a free and equal democratic society is built. Nevertheless, this criminal international terrorist group not only exists, but also openly engages in inhumane activities in full view of the global community, posing a real danger to society. You might ask, why haven't anti-cult organizations been held accountable for their actions? And why do they still exist? Because for many years, this transnational terrorist group operated in the shadows, using sophisticated manipulation techniques to conduct informational terrorist acts. It took 30 years of observing their activities and a 10-year investigation to uncover their tools and methods, and to establish their true goals. The presented facts clearly show that anti-cult movements are tools of the enemy of the entire free world for conducting covert terrorist acts in the informational space. This means they consciously aid the enemy's global plan for total power domination. In this context, anti-cult organizations are just one branch of a network of similar organizations that use the same methods, all led by a hidden shadow force, their ideological mastermind. All members of this network are the architects of a new world disorder. Their goal is the destabilization of society on all fronts: political, social, cultural, ideological, religious, and others. Therefore, destructors like anti-cultists are present in many areas of public activity and occupy various levels of the social hierarchy. They do not care whom they target or for what reason. The main objective is to persecute the innocent, which allows them to create informational terrorist acts to influence the masses. They are indifferent to who holds power. They will undermine any authority. The ultimate goal of their activities is globally orchestrated mass disorder, civil war, and the complete collapse of democracy. Each of them plays their part in the unified enemy scheme to destroy democracy and establish totalitarianism. Therefore, they draw into their network all those as deceitful and unscrupulous as themselves who can help achieve their goals. They strive to extend their influence worldwide. In some countries, they have already infiltrated the government. In others, they openly influence legislation. In some places, they even receive funding from the state. There is also a country that serves as the source of this harmful influence spreading across the globe. In this country, this shadow force already controls the government and is the real power. Through their actions, this entire international terrorist group is bringing about a new world order led by the hidden enemy, the enemy that is currently reviving the legacy of Nazism in a new, even more insidious form. For convenience and understanding, let's call this new form of Nazism global anti-cultism, after that branch of the unified network, on the example of which it became possible to study the methods and schemes of the hidden enemy through years of investigation, monitoring, and study of its activities. Humanity is facing a threat of this kind for the first time because right now there is a war, and it is a covert, undeclared war that has engulfed all of humanity.